Today I want to share with you how to make the rhythm tracks in your mixes pump. When you're mixing your music for TV shows or for trailers or for commercials, it's important that the rhythm instruments, the drums, the bass, and the guitars, and anything that's really keeping the beat and the rhythm of the track, it's important that they really pump and they sound beefy and thick. The reason is, when you're watching these shows, or you're sitting watching a trailer or you're watching a commercial, it's the rhythm that keeps the pacing of the commercial or the trailer or the show. So those really have to be prominent. The problem is a lot of people who are mixing their songs, they get so caught up with all the melody instruments that they end up forgetting about the rhythm instruments, and they just kind of get lost and buried in the mix. I don't want that to happen for you. So today I'm going to show you my starting points that I use every time I start a new mix. All right, so let's dive into the presentation, and I'm going to share with you some of my settings. So we're going to start with the drums, all right? And the kick drum is really the foundation for the drums. Now, when it comes to the kick drum, I don't use any compression. I'm going to share with you a little later here how I actually do compress my drums, all right? But as far as the individual drums, you're going to see that I use very little compression on the individual tracks. Starting with the kick drum, I use no compression, all right? Now, the meat of the kick drum is going to be somewhere around the 100 to 120 hertz range. And what I'll do is I'll use a low shelf. I'll move it to somewhere in that range, and then I'll boost it up just so I can get a lot of the meat out of that kick drum, okay? The attack of the beater hitting the actual head of the kick drum, that's going to sit somewhere between 800 hertz and 2 kilohertz. So what I'll do is I will sweep that frequency, and I will find where that attack is, and I'm going to give it a little boost there somewhere in that range with a fairly wide bandwidth. And then I'm going to scoop out something in the range of 350 to 400 hertz to get a tight smack out of the kick drum, to get that nice, top end attack of the beater, as well as the nice meatiness of that low end. Sometimes I will scoop out a lot in that range of 350 to 400 hertz, even up to 15 dB, because I really want to get a nice, clear sounding kick drum that's going to make room for all the other instruments that are going to fit in between those frequency ranges. That's going to lead us to the snare drum. Now, as far as the snare drum goes, the body of the snare drum is going to sit around 150 hertz. The crack of that snare drum is going to be up in the 6 to 10 kilohertz range. And I will approach the snare drum in the opposite way that I approach the kick drum. In the kick drum, I used a low shelf. The snare drum, I'll use a high shelf to really accentuate the crack of that snare drum. Again, you're going to probably have to scoop out something in the 300 to 400 range. Usually on a snare drum, it's really not going to be that much, though, because snares tend to be very bright. And the transients are very intense on this. Now, speaking of transients, when it comes to a snare drum, you really have to compress it to taste. It's going to depend on the style of music that you're doing. If you're doing a rock track, it's going to be a different type of compression than if you're doing a slow ballad or even a smooth jazz track. Now, the thing with the snare drum is we want to make sure that we can still hear the sizzle of the snares, okay? So when you hit the snare drum, you're always going to get a bit of the tss, right? That's the actual sizzle of those snares underneath the snare drum actually resonating. We want to make sure that we can hear that, but if you over-compress it, then you're going to take the transient out of it, and then you're going to just suck away all the life out of that snare drum. And we don't want to do that. Now, we are going to compress the entire drum track a little later on, and I'm going to show you a way that we can take care of this, all right? Next on the list, theoretically, would be a hi-hat. However, for me, it's not. I don't really use the hi-hat track a lot because it tends to get in the way of all the frequencies that actors use when they're talking. And I want to make sure that my hi-hat frequencies aren't really getting in the way of that. So I really just mute the hi-hat track. And my hi-hat will mostly be coming from the bleed in the snare track as well as the overheads. So that brings up the toms. Now the tom EQ is going to look a lot like a drum EQ. Generally, you're going to have anywhere between 2 and 4 toms depending on the drummer that you're working with. And so what I'll do is I will find the fundamental tone for each tom. And the way that you do this is you sweep the low mid-band frequency until you find the fundamental tone. Create a very narrow bandwidth and boost that frequency as high as it'll go, and then just sweep it. And then you're going to hear the ooh, right? You're going to hear that sound. That's going to be that fundamental tone for that particular tom. At that point, I'm going to take the low shelf EQ. I'm going to bring it up to that frequency, and I'm going to boost it. So I'm boosting it from the fundamental all the way down. Again, you may have to scoop out something in that 300 to 400 hertz range just to get it to sound tighter and more clear. Now the attack is going to be between 800 to somewhere up to 4K, depending on the size of the tom. And if you need to add some air, you can add that up in the 6 to 10 kilohertz range. It's not always necessary. Okay, just because you can add it doesn't always mean that you should. All right, it's oftentimes better to remove frequencies than be constantly adding frequencies. That's going to lead us to the overheads. And now with the overheads, I get rid of a lot of the low frequencies using a filter set to a 6 dB per octave setting. And that means that if I was to set that filter starting at 400 hertz, you just divide that frequency in half, that's an octave. So it would, between 400 to 200 hertz, it would filter out those frequencies at 6 dB. So it'd be a 6 dB drop. Then from the 200 hertz down to 100 hertz, it would again filter it out another 6 dB. So now you have a total of 12 dB down. And then from 100 hertz down to 50, another 6 dB. So we have a total of 18 dB that we filtered out between 400 hertz all the way down to 50. That's the way that a filter works, okay? We want to make sure that our high end sparkles. I would rather EQ the high end on my overheads to make them sparkle than focus on turning it up. If I'm just focused on turning it up, then I'm probably getting a lot of lower mid-range frequencies in the way, and that's just going to cloud up that mix a little bit. So I'd rather EQ the high end to make them sparkle instead of just pushing the levels up as a whole. Okay, and because we're doing such a dramatic EQ to this, to the overheads, it's in our best interest to EQ it before we slap a compressor on it. Now, when it comes to slapping a compressor on the overheads, you don't need a lot, just a little bit of compression. I like to use an 1176. I'll set it to a fast attack. I'll set the release to be the fastest release, and I only set it so I have 1.5 dB or so of compression. And that leads us to rooms. I don't have a particular starting point for rooms because so many drummers are working out of their own houses or their own, spaces that they have on their property, maybe a bonus room above their garage, or maybe even a studio that they built specifically for their drums. And each room is going to have its own size, all right? And the size of that room is going to determine really the depth of the drum track. And if you recall, in a previous video blog, I talked about mixes having width, height, and depth. And the room mics, that's where you actually start creating the real depth in the drum track, okay? So if you're working with a drummer who has a big room, say a big bonus room, and they can set those, room microphones maybe, 15 feet away from the drum kit, you're going to have some nice depth in that track. But if you're working with someone who's working out of a spare bedroom in their house and maybe the rooms are only, 4 or 5 feet from the drum kit, you don't have a lot of depth. So in that case, I would just recommend running those drum rooms through a reverb with a pre-delay set on the reverb, so that you can create you can create some fake space and some fake depth in their rooms. Okay, but I don't have a preset for that because it's going to be different depending on who you're working with. And that's going to lead us to the drum submix, and this is where the compression happens. What I do, I actually will employ the technique of parallel compression. If you've never heard of parallel compression, you should get to learn it. It will be your favorite form of compression, especially when it comes to drums. This is a technique where you're going to mix the dry, uncompressed signal. Notice I did not use a lot of compression on everything up to now. Okay, so I have a fairly dry, uncompressed, drum mix. All right, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to send that dry, uncompressed drum mix to a submix that I've created. I'm going to open up an auxiliary track, a stereo auxiliary track. I'm going to send all my outputs for my kick drum, my snare, my hi-hat, my overheads, my toms, my rooms, all that. They're all going to go to, in this case, we'll say buses 1 and 2. And the input for my submix is going to be bus 1 and 2. Then I'm going to duplicate that. So I have 2 exact copies of this submix. One I'm not going to touch. The other I'm going to add a compressor to. All right, and what this does is this allows you to control the dynamics of the sound without making it sound compressed. On one submix, we have all the transients popping through. On the other one, we can compress it a lot, and that's how we can get all the sustained tones and the body out of these individual drums. all right? And then we can adjust the levels accordingly to really get a nice beefy drum mix. Setting up a submix is very simple. It's often referred to as an advanced mix technique. It's really not. It just makes your mixes sound like they were done by a professional. But you can set up a submix really in less than a minute. If you are unfamiliar with this, I encourage you to get on YouTube and Google setting up parallel compression submixes on whatever DAW you use. But setting up a submix is very, very, very simple. All you want to make sure is that you have a duplicate of it, and then on one you are actually compressing the actual submix, on the other you're not. And then you're just going to play with the fader levels till you get to a point where it sounds nice and thick and full and beefy, but yet uncompressed. And you want to have a very natural compression from this. Now that leads us to the bass guitar. And my secret for the bass guitar is that I really can't get enough roughly 1 kilohertz. And that's going to depend on the way that the bass player is attacking the strings. Are they playing with their fingers? Are they playing with a pick? Are they slapping and popping the bass? We want to find the actual attack of that. It's going to change depending on whether they're using their fingers or whether they're using a pick. So we're going to sweep that range and we're going to find that attack, and then we're going to really give it a good boost with a very narrow bandwidth, because we want that frequency, just that attack frequency, to poke out in the mix. We also want to add some low end to get that bottom end girth out of the bass guitar. We want there to be some meatiness down there, all right? And again, we're usually going to suck out, like we have been, something in the range of 300 to 400 hertz to get some clarity out of that. We want to make room for other instruments. We don't want there to be a lot of mud in it, in the mix. And this is where the mud's going to sit. And sometimes you can suck out a lot on the bass guitar in this range as well, all right? Now, as far as compression, it's going to depend on how they're attacking the strings, just like the very first thing we talked about, the frequency for the attack. Are they actually slapping and popping the bass? If they are, then there's going to be a lot of transients there, and we might need to compress it a lot. Now, if that were the case, I actually would use parallel compression in this instance. Okay, I'd want to keep the transients from the slapping and the popping, and then I'd have another submix where I applied the parallel compression aspect to it, and I just compress the crap out of it. So that way we can really get the sustained tones, and the body from the bass. So that's why parallel compression works great on the bass guitar. Now, if they're playing with a pick, it's going to be a different compression setting. If they're playing with their fingers and their fingertips, it's going to be a different compression setting. So compressing the bass is really something that I can't give you a starting point on. It's going to depend on really how they're attacking the string. Are they being really aggressive with it, or are they being very laid back and smooth with it? That's going to change the compression settings for you. That's going to lead us now to the electric guitar. Now, with the electric guitar, first thing I do is I always set a high-pass filter, and I set it to around 100 hertz. Now, I'm just throwing 100 hertz out there. I literally will just bring it down there somewhere in that range, and I'll set it. It might end up at 127 hertz. Who knows? It doesn't really matter, because those lower frequencies we don't need in the guitar. They're being covered by the bass guitar. Also, a lot of guitar amps have some 60 cycle hum that get in the way. That 60 hertz hum. We want to get that out of there too. So I just set a high-pass filter. High-pass filter means that all the highs will pass beyond that certain point. To get the bite and some edge out of an electric distorted part, you can add around 3 to 3.5 kilohertz. If you want some sparkle and some crispness in a clean part with, say, nice delays, around that same frequency range is going to work for you. All right. Now, this is the first instrument that we've talked about so far that is often stacked multiple times. And when you stack a particular part and a particular instrument multiple times, there's going to be a frequency buildup. I'm going to call that the energy. Okay. So when you're stacking multiple rhythm guitar parts, you can use a spectrum analyzer to find the energy, which is basically that frequency buildup, and then you can start filtering out those frequencies across the various guitar tracks to make room for all the other instruments. We definitely don't want there to be a buildup of frequencies in a certain range. Okay, spectrum analyzer works great in this case. The pick attack is just like the kick beater. It's going to be in the 800 to 2 kilohertz range. And as far as compression, again, 1176, you can't go wrong with it. I'll set it to a 4:1 ratio, and I'll usually get up to about 3.5 dB of compression. If you're doing an electric guitar part with a lot of distortion, sometimes the amp will just inherently, this distortion is a form of compression anyway, so the amp may be compressing automatically, especially if you're using a tube amp and whatnot. So you generally might not need a lot of compression on that guitar. If you're doing clean parts that are really poking out and you have some really nice crisp transients, yeah, you're going to want to pull some of those out. So at 1176 with a fast attack will always work really well for you on electric guitar. Always a great starting point. And that's going to lead us to the acoustic guitar. And this is my secret for thickening a mono acoustic track. We're going to start by taking the track and we're going to pan it 30%, so roughly like this, one way. All right. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create a mono auxiliary track. We're going to put a short delay on it. You can set that delay somewhere between 9 and 11 milliseconds. If you go too high, our ear is going to start perceiving the actual like gaga in the delay. We don't want to hear that. Okay, we want it to be small enough that our ear doesn't hear it, but at the same point long enough that it does create some actual space and some width. Okay, so 9 to 11 milliseconds is a great starting point. We're going to take that auxiliary track, we're going to pan it 100% the opposite direction. So we have our acoustic guitar here, and we're going to have our auxiliary track panned 100% the other way. And what we're going to do is we're going to choose a bus for our auxiliary track. So we'll say in this case it's going to be bus 3, okay? And we're going to take the actual bus send on our guitar track and we're going to throw it into the delay that's on our auxiliary track. What's going to happen is we're going to hear our acoustic guitar track here, and as we start pushing up that fader, as we start throwing that into that delay, we're going to start hearing it come in all the way over here. And now we're creating width in our mix. Okay, so panning is, or width is created by more than just panning. Right? Width is created by stereo delays and stereo effects, as is depth. Okay, but now we're hearing this acoustic guitar suddenly become very wide. Now the main instrument is still sitting here. We don't want to bring the level up to where it's the same exact level. Then it just sounds like a big wall of acoustic guitar. We don't want that. We want to bring that level up to where we feel it coming through the other side, and now we have this wide acoustic guitar track. It's a simple way and so quick to make an acoustic guitar, even a simple acoustic vocal track, sound nice and thick. So that's going to lead us now to the vocal, all right? How do we thicken vocals? Well, if we have a thin sounding vocal to start with, we can add more body by boosting the 200 to 300 hertz range. Doesn't seem like there would be something down there, but believe me, there is. If you're dealing with a very thin female vocal, it may be a little higher. You may have to go up into the 400 to 500 hertz range. But there is body on the vocal down in that range. All right. Now, if we want to take our vocal's sitting straight in the center, and we want to thicken it up in our mix, we create a stereo auxiliary track, and then we put on a stereo delay. All right, so we put a stereo delay on our stereo auxiliary track, and we're going to set our delay, our stereo delay, we're going to set one side to be, say, roughly 9 milliseconds, the other side to be roughly 11 milliseconds. Now, again, this is short enough that our ear doesn't actually hear the actual delay. It doesn't hear a gaga. It just hears a thicker space, all right? So that's what we're going to do is we're going to have a stereo delay. We're going to set those settings on it. Again, these are just starting points, all right? Then we're going to choose a stereo bus. So in this case, it'll be stereo bus 5 and 6. All right. And on our vocal track, we're going to set the output for, we're going to set up a bus on 5 and 6. It's going to give us a little fader. We're going to start pushing that level up into the delay that we have on our stereo auxiliary track, because the input is bus 5 and 6. What's going to happen is we're going to hear this very mono, very thin vocal that's just right up in the center between our speakers. We're going to suddenly hear it get wide. It's going to start coming out in the left and right speakers. And again, we don't want it to be the same level as the main vocal. We just want it to create that width. All right. So that's how we create width. Now we're going to use regular delays and reverbs to actually create the actual depth in that vocal. But we've now created width by using this very short stereo delay. All right. So those are some starting points for you when it comes to mixing your song and just getting the ball rolling with your song. They've been the exact mix settings, I guess you could say. They're the exact mix settings that I've been using since 2006. 2006, I mixed a solo record of mine, and that's when I sat down. I really was very analytical, and I figured out what settings had worked in previous mixes for me, and I actually wrote a whole little sheet that I had taped up to the wall of the various studios that I've worked at over the years to really, learn these are some really good settings to start with. And I've just seen it so many times, it's just ingrained in my brain. So for the last 16 years, last 14 years of my mix career, these are the starting points that I've used on every mix that I've started. They work great when it comes to the licensing world. You're going to have to adjust once you get into the mix, of course, but these are great settings and they will work for you. All right, have a great week. We'll see you later.